Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Falsifiable Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Denton. And with me today is the theoretical physicist, best-selling author of many books. The one that we're going to focus on today is an oldie but a goodie, A Universe from Nothing. And we'll just get right into it. This is Professor Lawrence Krauss. So welcome, Lawrence.
Well, it's nice to be with you.
Oh, good. Before we get into your book, though, and I don't know, maybe a lot of stuff has changed within that realm since you wrote that book, which came out in 2012. I'm sure it has, given we got the James Webb Telescope and everything. But before we start, though, I just kind of want to get your impressions on America at its current moment with Trump entering office. You just released an article a moment ago about sort of making an analogy from the Trump administration to a reality show, which obviously he was a reality television star. But what's your impressions from the North?
Well, it depends. I say the Trump reality show analogy would sort of helped me put it in perspective and made me sort of think, well, okay, this is like a TV show worth watching, and as long as it doesn't turn tragic, I suppose I can be mildly amused at times. It's there were certain. It's a different election, a different uh, time around for him and the country. Uh, I there are three impressions I have. First of all, I predicted he would win. I mean, well, I didn't predict it. It seemed to me likely he would win.
Mm,
The Democrats had a weak candidate who ran a crappy campaign as far as I was concerned, and I even voted, but I was not thrilled to vote
right.
for her. Um, and there were certain aspects of what Trump's people were arguing, particularly regarding free speech and 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 opening up free inquiry in various locations that I thought was good. So, I viewed as there was some possibility of hope, and I still think there is.
Mm,
Um, but it was amusing to me in some sense that Trump has reverted to form. Um,
right.
and and so I expect, it will be a chaotic and presidency that will have some pluses and some minuses. And I'm not optimistic. Um, you may remember my favorite line from Cormac McCarthy when he talked to me and I say I'm a pessimist, but that's no reason to be gloomy. Um, and
That's good.
and I guess that's my attitude. We'll see. I think it's uh, I what I don't what I don't think had anything to do with this particularly was racism or sexism, and I sort of the loss by the Democrats, as far as I could see, had very little to do with anti-woman, anti-black. It was more that she was just a weak candidate. I thought she was a weak candidate the minute she was appointed. I thought she was a weak candidate when she was vice president, and so anyway, and I think I think she ran a campaign that was, not impressive. She refused to go out and speak about her policies, and she could have gone. Not that Joe Rogan matters or anything like that, but it was indicative of unwillingness to deal with the issues. And Trump, for better or worse, went everywhere, and
Right.
of course
Yeah.
lied extensively. I mean, he cannot speak with them, but nevertheless, he did. And, he reached out to people, and that had some impact. And I expect what happened, and what often happens, especially demagogues, is to convince people to vote against their own best interest. And certain groups of people, I think, will be surprised and disappointed. Others will be pleased. So,
Mm,
but I haven't reacted with the kind of utter malaise that I think I had the first time he was elected, when it just seemed impossible that someone like him could be elected president. And so, I guess maybe because I was preparing for it, and also because there were some positive. The right have, for better or worse, picked up what classical liberals, which has normally been the left, is all about, which is free speech, open inquiry, and they're concerned about it, and so am I. So maybe
right.
some good will happen in the midst of all this. Anyway, we shall
Yeah.
see. But I
Right.
think thinking about it as a reality show, at least for the moment, gives me
Mm.
some clarity and pause in worrying about the other consequences. So if we'll see. I expected. Last thing I'll say is I think whoever was elected, the country would have problems in 4 years. And I think that is still true.
Mm. I think you're right. I think identity politics sort of sank the boat on the on the left this time,
Yeah,
or on the
really has.
Democratic side.
People clearly don't buy it, and the left doesn't even understand it. A lot of people, and the worst thing is after the fact, you think you'd get the message, but a lot of people left seem to think, no, it's identity politics. It's somehow her identity other than her character and qualifications that made a difference, and the campaign of her opponent. And
Well,
so
actually,
I don't know what it takes to learn, but we shall see. And
yeah. On that note, though, we have it. I
I
mean,
mean, I guess I was going to make another tweet that what Marjorie, what is it, Marjorie Taylor Greene? What's her name? Is that it?
yeah,
Yeah, I see that she's heading the congressional committee that's going to interface with Elon Musk and the other guy. And
yeah.
I will probably tweet that I'm really happy to see that the country's best minds are working on this.
Right. That's what's crazy about it is the people that are fighting for free speech are on the vanguard of that. Sadly, what they have to say is really terrible. I mean, that's so you have, and then you have the left who sort of has notoriously the last couple years been somewhat suppressive of free speech, and they often will have rather good things to say about certain things about science and all, but then they inject the DEI stuff and it just negates everything. So it's just we have this weird bifurcation of terrible ideas on both sides
Yeah.
currently. And yeah, so on this note, though, before we get off this, what do you think of the idea of populism? Because this has become a big thing lately. I'm not a fan of populism, like right out the gate. It produces fertile ground for demagogues, whether you're right or left. And I feel like I've seen a lot of commentary recently where the left, people on the left, like on the Young Turks, which I'm not a fan of these people, but like Cenk Uygur will say things like, "We need a populist uprising on the left," and I'm just thinking, I think that's a bad idea. I mean, it's just,
Oh,
what do
I'm
you
not in
think?
favor of, I don't know what populism is except a new form of demagoguery. And so I'm never in
Hmm.
favor of it. In general, I think, I'm in favor of people connecting with the public,
Right.
but 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 trying to dig up emotions and us versus them and etc. is not something I'm ever in favor of. So,
Yeah.
I view populism as potentially dangerous, even if it's based on some idea that I like.
Right, yeah, like getting ideas from ordinary people or something
Yeah.
like that. That sounds good, but I was looking this up the other day and I can't find basically there are no good examples in history where populism actually resulted in a good thing. You have like Stalin in Russia and then Hitler, and all these were populist movements, and then you have
As I
Hugo
say, I think
Chavez, blah, blah.
um uh yeah, I think as I say, I think it's just an invitation to demagoguery, and demagoguery is a bad thing in my mind. In
Yes.
general. In
Yeah.
general.
And as you
Yeah.
know, you've been on the podcast before. I'm a huge proponent of Karl Popper, and if you read his Open Society, he's a liberal through and through, and a classical liberal, and he always pushes the idea of strengthening institutions, which I think is what we need. But sadly, as you put, I'm going to go to this. You put out an article the other day in a Canadian magazine, I suppose it was, the National Post, where you talk about DEI and how it's you would like it to be uprooted from the government funded scientific programs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, and I'm glad Elon got back to me on that actually when I wrote it. But um, if there is, look, there is some government waste, and I'd be happy for people to explore it. But I think the lowest hanging fruit is these scientific agencies that are devoting their resources and their time to something that isn't science. And if they had a lot of extra money, if they were the Defense Department, okay. But the National Science Foundation was cut by 8%, and that's about the amount of money that's being spent on DI that could be spent on science. And
Mm,
we and it not only is important for the fact that science is the thing that's going to help us address the challenge of the 21st century, but from the point of view of the United States, remaining competitive, it's important that, the other, it's trying to compete with China and other countries that are charging forward, supporting science without these PC constraints.
Mm. Yeah, you actually put in here, you said over 10% of the budget of the major federal agency supporting broad-based science and engineering in the United States is not devoted to supporting science. And when you think about 10%, it's actually a pretty large number when
Well,
we're
yeah, I
trying
mean,
to, yeah.
it's an estimate based on a simple kind of analysis we did, and more analysis should be done. But anything like that is seems like a large amount. Um,
Mm.
and and I wrote a piece earlier talking about some of the specific programs, and if you look at their titles, they're not very impressive. And more importantly than just the funding, I think that you have to replace the heads of these organizations who have bought into this notion that science is systemically racist or sexist and somehow needs to. I mean, they're least expressing virtue signaling about this, and they're trying to but they appear to be speaking with their, putting their feet where their mouth are. They're really spending money on
Mm.
this. And I
Mm.
think you need people who are saying that's, look, maybe there are issues that need to be dealt with in the country, but the National Science Foundation's mandate is to promote science and not to be a social advocate, do social activism. Same with the NASA, same with the NIH, and same with DOE. There are government agencies that should be targeting any areas of systemic problems and trying to improve the lot and opportunities of everyone in the country. But
Mm.
science agencies should be doing what they're supposed to do, and that's of some concern.
Do you think it's sad that we have to have billionaires or our richest citizens fund launching to space rather than the nation to do so?
Actually, I'm quite happy about it because I think human space exploration is largely a waste of money. And so I'm
Mm.
happy that billionaires fund it rather than the government. I think the government should be doing the best thing we can do in space, and that generally doesn't involve people. Involve,
Mm.
yeah, so, send satellites, rovers, all sorts of, telescopes and for science. Now, adventure is a different thing, and I can understand the government funding adventure. I testified before Congress many years ago with Buzz Aldrin, and I was saying that, it's all right to fund adventure and human space exploration as long as you say that's what you're doing. It excites young people. It excited me when I was a kid. I watched the I stayed home to watch the moon landings, and all of that does excite people, but it's not science, and it takes a lot of money. It takes a tremendous amount more money to send humans into space, and I really don't see the point. Um,
Mm.
so anyway, I'm happy that private industry especially when it comes to low Earth orbit. The federal government created the infrastructure and initially showed how to do it. And anything like that, it's great that private industry follows up on it. I don't see a role for private industry in the long run or in the short run, not the long run, but the short run, in terms of traveling the moon or Mars. I think that has to be government programs,
Mm.
and I don't see the point of sending a bunch of people to Mars to die there in the short term.
Right. That's
Anyway,
it. That's it. Well, coming from a theoretical physicist, this is interesting. As far as I think that it's sad though, because it might be that we've never went back to the moon and all. And if you look at, I think it's because the public just lost enthusiasm for it. But also, if you look at polling about what people believe in this country, you still have, I think Jerry Coyne actually stated this in a few lectures that he did. Like 19% of people in this country, this was a few years ago, only 19% believe evolution as put forth by scientists, whereas most other people believe like evolution along with,
yeah.
God's help. And then you have a large swath of people that still believe in young Earth creationism, which is just profoundly so far off the mark. I don't understand how we can fund things that we need in science whenever you have this type of thinking pushing, the funding.
Well, yeah. Look, well, it is unfortunate. It's an issue I've been involved with for some time, as you know. And sometimes it's hard to know what it means when people answer these questions. So I'm less. concerned about it than I might be otherwise, because I think people answer these questions based on what they think. Look, even those people who claim, accept evolution, many of them don't understand what evolution's all about.
Right.
So answering that question is one thing. I think it's important that science be taught in schools, and I'm concerned that in Texas right now they've just at least potentially adopted a curriculum which has a huge religious component. But again, I don't exactly know where it is. If it isn't in science classes, if it's in social science classes talking about, the Bible as an influential document, well, that's true.
Right.
I'm not going to be religious about my opposition to having any statements about the Bible in school. But certainly the public is largely scientifically illiterate, but some of the answers to these questionnaires, as I say, I think people are just answering it based on what they think they're supposed to say, and even people who say these things, then they read about, it's just people can carry on two completely incompatible ideas
Right.
at the same time. And so even when they say this, they read about ancient civilizations, they read about Homo erectus and Homo sapiens and discovering of new things that are a few 100,000 years old. And, so they don't put it together. So anyway, maybe I'm feeling in a generous mood with the holiday season coming up. I don't know.
That's a good point though, because yeah, you watch things like Nova or any of these science documentaries on Netflix nowadays, and they actually say good things, and people watch it and accept it. But for some reason, they have this cognitive dissonance where it's just like, oh, that's just the
Exactly it.
story.
It's exactly it. It's cognitive dissonance. And yeah, so it is what it is. What can I say?
Right. Okay, that out of the way. I think I'm with you though, just to put a fine point on this, talk about politics. I think I'm calloused from the last 8 years or whatever of the Trump era, and I just kind of, whenever he won, it was kind of a foregone conclusion as far as I could tell too. The moment he had those attack ads with Trump is for Kamala is for they them, Trump is for you, and that ran at the Super Bowl. I was like, we're
Oh,
screwed.
really?
We're freaking screwed. And I did say that I talked to Matt Johnson the other day, who wrote a book on about Christopher Hitchens. It's called How Hitchens Can Save the Left. Really
Yeah.
good book. But he and I were talking, and it's funny because Kamala actually distanced herself from identity politics in the sense that she never talked about it, but she didn't explicitly come out against it. And had she done that,
Oh,
it would have been a game changer. I mean, in a
yeah,
lot of
but she
ways.
also, well, the point is that she's been a huge proponent of it. She could have come out against it.
Right.
Um, but she actually has, pushed it further.
Yeah.
And so that was always a concern to me about her, I think, in general. But an intelligent campaign, nevertheless, regardless, um, uh, even regardless of her views, would have made it seem as if she didn't have those views.
Yeah. I
Uh,
would
uh,
I would
anyway,
just I encourage people to read books like from John McWhorter, Woke Racism. You might have talked to him, and then also Coleman Hughes. I recently read that book, The End of Race Politics. Both of those guys, when you read their work, I'm just like, this simply makes sense. And Coleman Hughes points out that that like the Ibram X. Kendis of the world and the Robin DiAngelos, he calls them neo-racists. And it actually is true to say that because they look through everything through a prism of skin color for some strange reason. It doesn't make any sense.
yeah, no,
And
no, absolutely. Uh, yeah. Anyway, and that's why um, cosmology, to make the segue, it takes us away from our petty myopic concerns about the present time, realizing this shoot too shall pass, and the
Mm,
cosmic sense we're all insignificant anyway.
right. Okay, so this brings it to us. Let's talk
I
about a
helped you
unit.
make the
Yeah.
segue whether you want to
You
or
did,
not.
you're a pro. This is why you're here. How did the universe begin, as far as you know currently, Lawrence?
I
Small
don't know
question.
any. I don't know. The answer is I don't know how the universe began. I
Right.
can talk about plausible ways, but I certainly don't know, and that's one of the exciting things in the
Mm,
end. Right? Um, uh, it, it, the fact that we can even ask the question is kind of amazing, and the fact
mm,
that we can give some potential answers that are plausible, at least, is even more amazing. Um,
mm,
and so, yes, I wrote a whole book, as you know, about how you could get a universe from nothing, and it showed that I think it's plausible,
mm-hmm.
and and most importantly, or I don't know, they're most importantly, but importantly, if you asked the question, what would a universe that was created from nothing look like if it was almost 14 billion years old? And I argued it would look exactly like the universe in which we live, which is highly suggestive. But the
Mm,
really interesting thing is we don't know, um, and uh, uh, and that's great because it means that's an invitation to learn, right? And
right.
but given extrapolating the laws of physics as we understand them, and expecting that gravity is a quantum theory, which we don't know for sure. Um, but assuming it is, then space and time become the quantum mechanical variables of a quantum mechanical theory, and
Mm,
that means they fluctuate, and you can have virtual universes that appear and disappear, and that space times that literally did not exist before they existed.
mm-hmm.
Most of them will disappear, and some of them, under certain circumstances, could actually survive. And I argue that under the circumstances that they survive, they would look like ours. And so it is kind of amazing. And moreover, that they're empty universes. And it seems like um, you can't have a universe with 100 billion stars and in every galaxy or more on average in 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe and uh, and get all that for free. But it looks like you might be able to, that the total energy of the universe could be zero. So I think one of the reasons that people think you need someone to create this is that that stuff is different than no stuff. And
Mm,
classically and intuitively it is. But the great thing about science is that our intuition is sometimes wrong.
right. Yeah, so the big ideas in your book that you circle around are the ones that kind of the theory that you put forward in there, which is I don't it's something that you elaborate on rather this theory, but it is things like the idea that the universe is flat geometrically, and also inflation plays a big part of this, and also cosmic or excuse me particles bursting in and out of existence at the molecular level. These are like the components that you talk about in the book. It's actually highly technical. I've read your book. This book I've literally read like
Really? I
four
think it's
times.
all, you think it's highly technical. Okay, I just think it's a breeze. It's like, it's a breeze. The ideas are difficult, but I like to think that they're well, there's no equations anyway. I think that look, anytime you're going to talk about such fundamental things, it's required some it's not easy subject.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I think that I like to think that anyone who wants to puzzle through it, even without any significant scientific background, can at least get the perspective of what's happening without clearly the details. And
Mm,
it's really weird to think of a space-time existing that didn't exist before, and quantum mechanics and particles fluctuating in and out of existence, and how a whole universe can have zero total energy, and how empty space can have energy. I mean, forget the public. No scientists understand that.
right.
It really does, but it's the biggest mystery in science. We have not the slightest clue why empty or how empty space gets the energy it has, and that's fascinating. It's the biggest mystery in science, and I'm honored to have played a role in some ways in at least helping us realize that that problem exists.
When you talk about a flat universe, though, and we're talking about inflation, where it's just the idea that at some, like 10 to the minus 44 whatever seconds it is, it expanded at an exponential rate, and then it slowed down and all this kind of stuff. A flat universe, though, am I to make of this that the universe expanded very quickly, and it's still expanding right now because of dark energy and all? It's getting pushed even faster the further away you look. Is it just flat because of how big we're talking about here and it seems flat geometrically, or
Well,
is
yes. I mean, when you say flat again, don't, I mean that's a two-dimensional flat, and I'm
right?
talking about three-dimensional flat, which is just the world you always thought you lived in with the X, Y, and Z or Z, depending on what country you're in,
Right.
axes perpendicular and always pointing in the same direction throughout all space. But the answer is yeah, it looks flat because it's big. And
Mm,
in fact, as I point out in the book, if you want to consider creating space-time with zero total energy, the only one we know that has zero total energy is a closed universe for sure. And
mm,
so it's if you had to guess, you might say on scales much bigger than the scale in which we see, because inflation has puffed up our universe and made it look flat. On scales much larger than that, it's actually closed.
mm,
And I'd say if I had to guess, if I had to make a bet, I'd say that's the most likely bet. Will we ever know about it? No. But because it's on scales much bigger than the horizon. But
right.
yeah, so the answer is the universe looks flat. That doesn't mean it is flat. It just looks flat, and it looks flat to an unbelievable accuracy, right? Um,
Hmm.
uh, well, I mean, yeah, it looks flat to a very high. It looks, I mean, we can only measure directly the flatness of the universe to maybe 1% or better than 1%. But when you apply physics and mathematics to that 1%, you realize that basically the fact that after 14 billion years it looks flat to be 1% accuracy, the only way that could more or less happen is if it was flat, as if it were fine-tuned to be flat to many, many decimal places early on in the history of the universe. And
Mm,
fine-tuned not by God, but by inflation.
mm. I was about to say, when you say fine tuning, I can just feel the
Yeah, all
audience
the people.
being titillated by
Maybe say naturally tuned. I won't say fine-tuned. It's naturally tuned by inflation to be flat.
right.
I think that's a good idea. I'm going to from now on say natural tuning.
It does it for some reason. The other way of saying it does it implies it has an implication
Yeah,
to it, I
yeah,
feel like.
it's natural tuning, not fine.
Uh, well, in
Yeah.
this picture though, you talk about in the book how lucky we are, and Dawkins actually highlights this in his afterword, but how lucky we are to live in the current time we're in because of the fact that we can still see galaxies beyond our own galaxy in the universe. Could you extrapolate on that for a moment?
Well, I mean, look, if the energy of empty space continues to be constant,
Hmm.
then, as you pointed out, on the largest scales, objects are or will be receding from us effectively faster than light, meaning they will effectively disappear from our horizon and from visibility.
Mm,
What actually happens is they get redder and redder and redder, and the redshift will eventually make them invisible. But effectively, they'll disappear. And in the far future, there won't be any. And by far future, I mean 2 trillion years or so. There
mm,
won't be any observable galaxies outside of our local cluster. So the universe will look cold, dark, and empty,
mm.
largely outside of our galaxy, and it looks static, by the way, which is the universe we thought we lived in 100 years ago. So we're fortunate, if you want to think of it that way, to be able to see all these galaxies now. And as I think I may have said in the book, if I didn't, I should have. Um, it's an argument for funding science now while we have a chance.
Right. Yeah, you do say that in the book.
Okay.
There's a sort of
It's a joke I can't imagine I would have thought to put in.
there's kind of an implication though in your book that you don't say. It's implied, or at least I took it this way, that the scientists in the far future will be different than humans in a way because you're always talking about they won't be able to discover, but we're here now. Are you thinking that we'll probably kill ourselves off before that happens, or a 2 trillion years? I mean, we'll probably
I mean,
look like
look,
different.
I think it's highly likely that any remnant um, of our existence will survive that period.
Right.
Um, I think it would be highly optimistic, and I think I think it's I think it's not necessarily likely that humans will survive much longer than they've already survived.
Mm,
Uh, but maybe they will, and maybe they'll create objects, and I don't think they'll be humans, or I don't think they'll be living objects that will survive the Earth. I mean, and travel out into space, silicon-based objects, and maybe that'll be some remnant. But I mean, there's a lot of cosmic disasters that are going to happen, and not least, our sun expanding in 5 billion years to encompass the orbit of the Earth. Um, in our local system, even though it won't go supernova, other supernovas nearby that can, or that may eventually do things. Eventually, the fact that in the long term, after the rest of the stars in our galaxy stop shining, that you'll have friction and eventually it'll all become part of one large black hole. At which point, so I mean,
Mm,
we are not eternal, and I think actually that was the motivation for my book, Adam. I
mm-hmm.
was once in walking through the Rodin Museum in Paris, and I saw the Kiss, which is a very famous Rodin sculpture, and I started to think, wow, there's a moment in life immortalized, but it's not immortalized because the marble has only been around for a certain amount of time. It'll only be around for a certain amount of time, and even our atoms, as I argued, may not be around forever. So we are finite when we should enjoy our brief moment in the sun, and whether we kill ourselves in the next 100 years or whether civilization survives in some form or another for thousands of years or millions of years or billions of years, in the long run, it's all going to end badly.
Mm. Right. Yeah, that's sort of a focus in your book. You talk about, I think you actually say that one of the things that motivated you was trying to figure out how the universe ends. And then you
Yeah,
quote
yeah. I
that.
wonder. Well, I was one of the reasons, one of the things that motivated me um, um, to study cosmology is the possibility that I could be the first person that know how the universe would end. That seemed like a really good idea at the time.
Mm,
It turns out all my motivations for doing it were wrong. But to understand it at the time involved knowing how much dark energy there was, what dark energy is made of, what the density of the universe is, whether it would expand forever or collapse. All of that's
mm,
what motivated me to apply the kind of ideas from particle physics to understand the early universe. And it's amazing that we can say even with any confidence what's likely. It's
mm,
just amazing sitting here on this or on this remote place in the middle of nowhere. This uh, hominid that's been, cognizant of science for less than a millennium is able to say with confidence about how the universe may have begun and how it's likely to end, and that we can measure and observe 100 billion galaxies and look at potentially habitable planets. And it's just shocking that we can do that.
yeah, it is. This actually, I'm going to ask you this just because I don't see any physicists talking about this, and this makes me feel like there's no there there. But this whole notion of aliens having visited our planet, what is
Oh,
your
there,
take on
there.
that? That I don't think so either, given our
No, no, no. It's I don't even have to think. Well, it's highly unlikely. It's so unlikely that it's just more likely that a unicorn will be in my backyard, and there isn't one right now.
right.
Um, but they haven't. There's the likelihood that aliens have been visiting is just ridiculous, given the physical problems of coming here. And why would they come here? And we're in a remote place. It's galaxies is big and it's hard, and it's just when you think of all the likelihoods, anything is more likely than UFOs being due to aliens. And early, somehow, I mean, the old 2001 Space Odyssey idea, it's very poetic
Hmm.
and it sells books and
Right.
movies, but it doesn't really hold water, if you ask me.
I don't think so either. And I always wonder why people look into that. They're like, "Oh, did you see this new video?" I'm like, "Yeah, but I don't see any scientists, serious minds thinking about this at all." And I've heard David
Well,
Deutsch and all have talked about this, and they're just like, "Yeah, that's no, there's not."
yeah, well, I mean, it's not that they're not thinking about it. They thought about it and dismissed it. Well, if they
Right.
don't want to think about it, great. Gee, if there could be, if we could have if I could talk to aliens, it'd be fascinating.
Hmm.
So scientists have thought about it, but it just seems so unlikely that we going on to do reasonable work rather and it was Feynman who first said that, when you're a scientist, you sort of think about what you're going to work on and you decide what's likely, what's significant, and so it's not as if you close your mind to these things. You just say, well, this is highly unlikely to be a useful expenditure of my time
Right.
based on what I know. And I'm happy to be proved wrong, but based on what I know, I'm going to choose to do X rather than Y.
Yeah, yeah, because you had, somebody like Carl Sagan had, was heavily involved with SETI, and it makes sense to, point radio telescopes up to the sky and try to figure things out. But again, we haven't heard anything yet. Scientists are looking into it, but again, until you
Well,
see
yeah,
something,
we
you
haven't
know.
heard anything, and there's also no evidence for any really habitable planets. I mean, there's no evidence for Earth-like planets with atmospheres, and there may be other ways of being habitable, but the simplest one is like one we know. In fact, it's been a disappointment. If you that we've discovered the non-disappointment is we've discovered literally thousands of extrasolar planets around every star type you can imagine and every planet type you can imagine, but no
Mm.
evidence that any of them are a good place to look for life yet, and that's maybe a little depressing.
Did Fermi, was he like, he was sort of the one that kind of popularized this notion that we don't see anything, we haven't heard anything, the
The
Fermi
Fermi
paradox?
problem,
Yeah.
yeah, or Fermi's paradox, or whatever you call it. Um, he said, "Well, if they're out there, where are they?" And he pointed out that it's physically possible
Mm-hmm.
in a few billion years to travel a significant amount, fraction of the galaxy, and life, if it wanted to propagate continually, could have populated a lot of the galaxy. Well, I think that was naive in some ways, many ways, actually. First of all, I
Mm-hmm.
just don't see that there's this impetus to travel. I mean, humans physically, the laws of physics would have allowed humans to have traversed the oceans and discovered other civilizations long before they did. In
Mm-hmm.
order to leave, you have to develop a lot of infrastructure, and you have to want to go and be willing to die, or return and go and never be able to return and stuff. And so it's not clear to me that there's always this impetus to move out. Plus, plus, it's quite likely that civilizations don't survive long enough to do it. But
Mm-hmm.
also, if they do, and if there are civilizations that are billions of years older than ours, and I highly doubt it, but if there are, then uh, I think that their attitude would be, why would they want to? They wouldn't want to reach out. What would the point be? They,
Right.
they
Yeah.
want to probably sit and stare at their navels and going on because they know all the stuff. And so there's lots of reasons from why I think the Fermi paradox could be resolved. Um, and um, but who knows? Anyway, the point is that we right now we don't know of life elsewhere in the universe,
Mm.
and maybe we're alone.
Yeah.
I I think it's highly unlikely, but I also think it's highly unlikely we'll ever know about it.
Yeah, that's probably the
I mean,
most.
in a sense, it's almost nice to act as if we're the only form of life in the universe, because maybe it makes the whole thing more precious, and maybe make us take care of this place more. But
Mm.
who knows?
What about you kind of go hard on string theorists. You poke fun at them in your book a little bit here and there. Not as much. I mean, in the beginning, you kind of make a jab at people, but then you talk about Brian Greene at the end. They're doing
Well, I guess
interesting work, but it's
it's kind of too easy a target now than it used to be. I used to poke more fun of it when it wasn't an easy target.
mm,
Um, but string theory is a great, the ideas behind string theory are remarkable, and as a development in science that came up to that, it's kind of amazing. And point is, however, it hasn't had its successes, in my opinion, in any of the things it was originally touted as being successful, potentially successful to be able to do, including explain why our universe is the way it is, or demonstrate that it has that it, that our uni that it, the mathematics of string theory is relevant for understanding our universe, the nature of space and time. The mathematics of string theory has been quite useful for in other areas of physics for helping us solve difficult problems. And so it hasn't been a waste of mental energy, but it just hasn't done the stuff it was touted to be able to do. And it's certainly, and among the biggest failures of string theory, and I said this 20 years ago, at least, well, maybe, yeah, 20 years ago now. Um, it did it the string theory never predicted an energy of empty space, and if it did, it would have predicted an energy being the opposite sign that has. And so all of the discoveries have been surprises. And if string theory, the one thing that you think string theory might give insight on, if it's a theory of space and time, is the energy of space and time. And in
mm.
fact, it missed the boat completely. So, you know,
And
in general, it thinks theories find it's very hard to accommodate a positive cosmological constant.
mm. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and then in the book you talk about how you dig into string theory, then you have to eventually get into brains, or what are they? It's something
Well,
of
string
this
theory is
nature.
now, I mean, it's strings are not the key part of string theory anymore. That's absolutely true. It's, brains um, larger dimensional structures, and boundary conditions for those structures. It becomes a much more complicated theory.
Right. And you and I have talked about this before. I think the first time you came on the podcast, we discussed multiverse quite a bit. I have been convinced, again, as an amateur, I don't know the math that you do. You can say, and you've actually pointed me to a video, which I did watch, Quantum Mechanics in Your Face by your
Oh, by
friend,
Sidney
yeah,
Coleman.
Sidney Coleman, correct. But I'm still convinced by the Deutsch side of things and like the Everettians of within the field that that type of multiverse seems to be the best explanation to describe how particles are in a
Well, it's
superposition.
the best classical kludge. If you
Right.
ask me what's the best classical kludge interpretation of quantum mechanics, I'd say the Everett many worlds interpretation. I wouldn't call that a multiverse. I'd say that's many worlds because it's very different. The multiverse involves real things that are coexisting in at the same time and in the same reality. And the many worlds interpretation is arguing that each moment of reality picks a branch, but the other realities are totally separate and not and don't have any existence at the same in the same plane or anything.
That
Whereas a multi
one,
in inflation involves a universe much larger than our horizon, and in string theory involves the possibility of other higher dimensional or four-dimensional universes in a higher dimensional space. So those are quite different.
right. Yeah, Deutsch describes it in one of his books like it's more of like it's not a splitting that happens. He talks about it as like it's almost like the strata of the ground where you have like little, like here and there, everything starts to work at information only travels at the speed of light. So in each one of these things, you have changes that are happening, but the multiverse essentially in his eyes is like the strata just kind of ebbing and flowing sort of from the beginning of the Big Bang. It kind of was always there and it just started separating from then on. It sounds crazy, but again, it's like
It's the way measurements are made. That you have things that are quantum correlations that eventually decorrelate, and you talk. And there's a whole industry of talking about measurement theory, how you can start from a quantum mechanical system and turn into a classical measurement. And I
mm,
think that he's interpreting that in that way, as things get decorrelated and quantum wave packets separate and become become defined or isolated
right.
and and yeah, but I still don't, and he's thought a lot about this, but and as I say, I think classically the best way to picture it is the way he's picturing it, but I don't think we have to picture it classically, and I personally don't. um I mean, all these things like collapse of the wave function, as Sydney says, there's no collapse of the wave function.
Mm,
It's just recognizing that we're quantum observers.
mm,
That's the thing that Pitt City points out, is that we're quantum mechanical objects too. And when we measure a quantum mechanical system, and we feel classical, but we're governed by quantum mechanics. And so when we see something, it looks like the wave function's collapsed, but it's just really what we're doing is measuring. We're making a measurement from one quantum system of another quantum system. And
right.
it's like imagining we're not animals or we're outside of nature. Well, we're not outside of nature and we're not outside of quantum mechanics. And so therefore you can't ever you can't ever get outside the box and do an observation. Every observation is still made, even though we're classical objects in the sense of all of the quantum correlations that may have, exist temporally and spatially on small scales are wiped out on the scales that we can see and measure and experience. We are nevertheless governed by quantum mechanical rules, and so we have to understand it's the whole thing is a quantum mechanical system, and there are two parts of it interacting, and what one part interprets as a measurement may appear classical and may appear like a collapse of the wave function of the other object, but it's not.
Mm. Okay, so
I
this
think I think I think Sidney Coleman definitely gives the best argument, and since Sidney is smarter than me, he probably presents it better too. Well, not anymore, he's dead, but but he was certainly a remarkable scientist.
Right. Yeah, and it's worth looking at that. And also, I think you had pointed out there's a transcript that you can find of his lecture, which is interesting
Yeah.
for people that are interested in it. This is okay. So, something we always talk about when you come on is epistemology. In the book, there's a part where you say, until we open our eyes and let nature call the shots, we are bound to wallow in myopia. But to me, again, this is a
Well, I
very,
like that. Did I write that?
you wrote that.
Okay, boy,
It's
that's
good. It
good.
sounds great.
Yeah.
And actually this is something I would have completely agreed with, probably a decade ago, but now having read a bunch of Popper, and again, it's here comes these damn philosophers. But I think that it actually is the other way around. Like it's not nature calling the shots. It's us as universal thinkers, universal creators calling the shots as far as we are the ones that are applying natural laws. And this, we don't even know there's never a moment where we can prove for sure that the natural laws that we are currently using are the definitive natural laws, is my point. So everything,
You know what? No matter what I do, that's going to happen.
right?
And
Yeah.
I don't see that I'm calling the shots. I can
No,
interpret that, but I'm not calling the shots.
but
You think if you want to call the shots, step out my window and take a walk in the air,
right. No, I agree with that, but we have explanations that everything's based on explanatory power rather than empiricism. Like empiricism is only for testing things, whereas when you back in the day, whenever you had people like who was Democritus,
empiricism is only for testing. Empiricism, I mean, what else is there but empiricism? What else is there but experience?
there's theory, there's creation in your head.
You then well, okay, you develop ideas based, but they're all based on observations, measurement, and experiment. And if they aren't, they lead to nonsense.
They're based on problems, though. That's my point. Is like so back in the day, you had Leucippus and you had Democritus, and whenever they look at a rock or they look at the world, they're trying to think, what is this stuff made of? And then they actually said that it made of atoms, not like the atoms that we think today, but it was an interesting idea. It turns out, down the road that a lot of
It's
it,
an interesting idea without substance, but I mean, it was an interesting idea, but he didn't have anything to back it up on, so it wasn't science.
right at that point, it
It was
wasn't science.
philosophy.
Right, or natural science, I would say
It
more
was well,
so.
no, it wasn't
Yeah.
natural science. It was natural philosophy,
Mm.
at a time before science really existed in the modern sense, and it was fine because at that time that was the only game in town. Philosophical questions were the only th and thinking about them critically were the only thing and the best thing you could do. But eventually, we stumbled on this notion that you can actually measure the world and try and learn from it rather than imposing your mindset on how the world should be.
The reason I'm bringing this up though is because Richard Dawkins, who I also deeply admire, I've read I think every one of his books at least a couple times probably, but I wrote an article and it was I sort of went after him a smidge whenever he talks about he gets annoyed by the Popperians of the world in an extent to a degree because he's like I know we can't prove things but and he talks about evolution. It's just the fact that this is just simply the thing, and I agree with him there. But because it's the best explanation for what we see, in the natural
Sometimes,
world.
well, no, when he's saying sometimes you can't ask why. Well, you can ask why, but it doesn't mean anything. Absolutely. Why did the
Mm,
universe exist is not a question that I think makes much sense.
right. Yeah, and you talking about that in a universe of nothing, you change it to how instead of and you
Yeah,
move
because
away
most of
from.
the time, whenever we're talking about why, we mean how.
Hmm.
I mean, why implies purpose, and unless you know there's purpose, then you're automatically making an assumption that may not be true.
Right, but would you say
You're
though that
assuming, you're assuming your epistemology is you're making assumptions um, about purpose, and humans have this innate inbred desire to find purpose in things.
mm,
What's the word? And what's the? There's a philosophical word. It starts with a
oh
T.
teleological
Yeah,
teleology. Yeah.
teleological. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was going to say teleology, but I wasn't certain. but since I
Mm.
was talking to a full philosophy buff, I figured I'd ask. Um, and we, it's just where we naturally want to find purpose, but that doesn't mean there is purpose.
Yeah, but the reason I bring this up though is like a lot of times you will hear people like creationists, for instance, will argue. But by the way, like I don't take any of these arguments are just they're
Sure,
shut
I know you're being a
they're sh
devil's advocate,
they're
and that's
shut
fine.
down in within a second.
I'm all in
But
favor of that.
yeah, so you have a creationist that says, "Well, you weren't there at the beginning." I've heard this argument. How do you know? You didn't see it. I'm like, because we have a theory that's based on
It's
good
not we have a theory.
explanations.
We no no we do more than theory. We have look. You're
Well, we have predictions that have been
we have
tested.
evidence.
Yeah.
We have evidence. We have empirical evidence, and
Hmm.
it's not as if people claim that evolution is historical science, but it isn't. All science is historical science. Whenever I've done an experiment, the experiment is in the past.
Mm,
What science does is take the evidence of that experiment in the past and make predictions about the future,
right.
about experiments and observations that haven't yet been made. And we do that with evolutionary biology all the time. We observe, we take the evidence that exists, we make a prediction, and we say, yes, if humans and apes were once related, then I would expect the number of, and they have different number of chromosomes, I would expect one might be able to see a chromosome, basically fold, and hey, what do you see? That's what happened. So it's exactly the same as chemistry and physics. It's not historical in any sense that they aren't.
Mm. Yeah, the
It's
reason
a
I
false dichotomy. It's a false notion of historical science that you weren't there. Well, you're not there. You weren't there. Um, maybe you didn't wake up in time to see the sunrise, but I think you'd be very amazed if you said, therefore, the sun didn't rise.
mm. Yeah, no, I agree with you there. But again,
It's
I
we
think
can't prove it, but it's so likely that we call it a fact.
right. I think that so yeah, I'm working on something. I'm working on a book that's involving it's bifurcated between Darwin and Popper. It's basically Popper's epistemology just trying to be put in a more simplistic point of view so
But
people
I'm
can
sure I won't
understand it.
understand it, but okay.
Oh no, you definitely will. You're freaking, are you kidding me? But
I can barely say epistemology. Anyway,
well, here's the thing, is I talked to Michael Shermer about this. I wrote an article. He actually published it, and I was like, and I said, the thing is epistemology. I'm not using the word epistemology. I'm going to try to steer clear of that because people's eyes glaze over when you start saying things like teleology,
I
epistemology.
I love that I use teleology all the time. They're so scholarly.
Right.
And epistemology, I learned those words so that anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. So anyway, so yeah, I'm trying to, I just want to, along with people like, again, David Deutsch has been a huge inspiration in this. In epistemology, I've sort of become passionate about it. But again, it's like I think that all rational people, and I'm talking about people that are trying to have good explanations behind things and not posit things that just add like logical infinite regressions like whenever
Yeah,
God people
turtles
I
all the way down.
exactly. I heard somebody the other day on this reel that just annoyed me. It was like on Instagram or something. The guy says, and people were amazed that whenever he said this, he goes, "Yeah," he goes, "I mean, atheists, what do they got? They don't. I mean, it's not even logical what they're saying. There's nothing. God, there has to be a creator because there is creation." And I was like, "That's an infinite regression within logic, though, because the God is just a blank thing that who created him? You know
Yeah.
what I mean?" So, and on and on and on. But as you say, we may never get to the bottom of that. We probably won't to the very bottom of where we
Well,
came
I
from.
don't think, yeah. I mean, in my last book, The Edge of Knowledge, which you have, is all about the known unknowns. And that's what it's called in England. And it's, I expect will always be that way. And there'll always be known unknowns. And more interestingly, there'll be unknown unknowns. And I hope that's why it's kind of cosmic job security if you're a scientist.
Mm, gotcha. Okay.
Maybe, which I must admit is a good way to end this podcast, but I don't know.
Yeah. Man, this is awesome. I always appreciate it, Lawrence. You've been kind to me ever since we started talking and doing these podcasts, and I just greatly appreciative of your time.
It's a
And man, until next time, we'll end it right here. And
Okay,
I'll
until next time, you take
yeah.
care.
All right, Ren.
Okay.
All right, later.